Chapter 19. The 12 endoskeleton AIU stood perfectly still atop a low hill to the north of the plant, only 100 yards from cliffs overlooking the turbulent sea. They'd marched to the north and stood sentinel in position, overlooking Serrano Point. They were machines, metal soldiers with computer brains, without any emotion whatsoever. They'd wait in position forever if it was required. Attention all AUs. Incoming message. Stand by. AIU Units 1 to 12 commence attack on Serrano Point's north perimeter. Target HK airfield and engage enemy AIU. All units prohibited from attacking power plant structures. The machines instantly stepped forward as one, raised their plasma rifles and marched down the hill towards the plant. AIU-01, at the head of the 12-strong spread-out formation, identified 7 automated plasma cannons in their vicinity, positioned along the hilltops to the north of the plant. An HK flew up in the air at 3,000 feet and curved round towards them. AIU-01 transmitted targeting data to the other units, and as one they all pointed their plasma rifles at a number of targets and opened fire. AIUs-01, 02, and 03 aimed upwards and fired multiple plasma blasts into the sky, sending burning plasma gas up into the air, glowing incandescently like tracer fire. Several shots struck the HK, and its right engine blew apart. The still functional left jet flipped the hunter-killer onto its back, and it plummeted, smashing down onto the ground with an almighty eruption of flame as its hydrogen fuel ignited and blasted the machine apart. The fireball rose up rapidly and turned bluish-purple as the plasma stores on board ignited and added to the conflagration. More shots whipped across the air almost silently from the rifles and struck all 7 inactive sentry guns, causing even more explosions to flare in the night sky. AIU-01 to AIUs-02 to 12. Initial targets eliminated. Advance towards factory and engage defenses. It didn't take long for Skynet to react. It was almost completely blind. All Serrano Point sensors had been disabled, but it could still see what was happening via the HK's sensors and was still in command of its machines based at the plant. It launched 2 more HKs from the airfield and mobilized 20 AIU to target whatever threat was approaching from the north, having lost contact with the automated weapons in that sector. The Skynet endos marched out of the plant, brandishing their own weapons identical to Cameron's AIU. The reprogrammed machines were still at an elevated position halfway up the hill they'd started from and fired down on their opponents. Height provided them the advantage as their shots rained down from above onto the Skynet endos, smashing into their armored chassis and melting hyperalloy armor. 3 Skynet machines were felled in the first 2 seconds of the attack. The defending units fired back, and brilliant flashes of blue-white plasma crisscrossed the air as both sides unleashed a torrent of ammunition at each other. 3 endos targeted AIU-06 and fired rapid single shots. White-hot superheated plasma smashed into its upper torso and sent molten pieces of its armor flying, but its chassis withstood the first few shots before the fire from 3 weapons boiled through its tough body and shattered the fuel cell recessed in the center of its chest. AIU-06 fell to the ground, inactive. The remaining machines attempted to pick up the slack and increased their rate of fire, concentrating their shots on a small number of enemy machines to disable or destroy them quickly, and then target another. 2 Skynet machines went down, then 3. A 4th was decapitated by shots from 04, before a flurry of shots smashed into 08 and 09. 10, 11, and 12 concentrated their fire on a single endo and fried it with 24 shots between them before they targeted another machine. The reprogrammed AIU were outnumbered, but they compensated with the advantage of their height up on the hill and the sheer ferocity of their attacks. All AUs, Advance into Serrano Point perimeter immediately. Neutralize all hostile forces and internal defenses. Cameron received reports from the AIU attacking the plant and saw 2 HKs take off from the landing field into the air and turn north. She still had access to the security systems and eavesdropped on Skynet issuing orders to mobilize a further 10 AIU to proceed north and engage the unknown attackers. She knew with reinforcements, her reprogrammed units wouldn't last long. They had to move quickly. "We're ready," Cameron said to John. Without another word, John took point position and quickly marched forwards. Cameron took up stride next to him, followed by Savannah, Ellison, Derek, and Kyle. They moved in silence, and John broke into a run, wanting to get there as quickly as possible, and knowing that Cameron would be aware of any threat to them even whilst moving quickly. They ran over the uneven, muddy terrain into the valley, and John spotted the large sentry guns positioned over them, facing down from the hills into the narrow passage and looming menacingly over them. Between those and the HKs and Endos, John reckoned Skynet could easily repel a whole army advancing from the land. He hadn't asked Cameron, but he imagined that the Seaborn Commando assault his future self had thought up had been a pretty bloody battle. "I hope those things don't come back online," Derek muttered nervously to Kyle. What made him even more worried was, from what John had told them, all that kept the plasma cannons from blowing them away was Cameron. What if the cyborg had a glitch? He thought grimly. A few shots from the monstrous weapons would wipe them all out. "They won't," John said quietly. "Where are all the Endos?" Ellison asked. He looked all around and expected to see at least some defenses. Seeing their path unopposed just seemed wrong, like they were walking into a trap. "Skynet sent them north to engage the AIU attacking," Cameron replied. She received another casualty report from her forces. Another unit had been lost, and there were only 7 remaining. "Stay prone to the ground. Operate in pairs and fire and man," however, she ordered them. The one disadvantage the machines had in combat was they had no sense of self-preservation and simply stood whilst firing. Ordering them to adopt human tactics would preserve her machines long enough for her, John and the others to complete the operation. "Stop." Cameron raised her hand to signal the others and gestured for them to crouch. "Machine." She pointed to a low hilltop just before the plant itself, a mile from their current position, where a single Endo stood and faced to the east. It hadn't seen them yet, but if it turned its head just slightly, she estimated it would see them. She took aim with her plasma rifle, targeted the Endo's skull, and fired 3 rapid shots. Blue-white plasma tore through the air in a fraction of a second towards the machine. The first shot smashed into the side of its skull, just below the chip port, and burned into the hyperalloy as the force of the shot knocked it askew. The second shot struck, just below the first, and melted through the already weakened metal. The third bolt shattered what was left of its protective armor and boiled the CPU into soup inside the skull. The machine dropped to the ground. "Clear," Cameron said simply as she stood up and took point. "Not bad," Savannah smirked. "Couldn't have done it better myself." "Thank you," Cameron smiled politely. "Stay here," she told everyone. She made her way up the hill, crouching down as she neared the top, and lay prone on the ground as she crested the very tip of it. The Endo was inert. A wide-open hole in its skull smoked slightly, and she smelt the faint odor of burnt metal and silicone. In the distance on the far side of the plant, she could hear the firefight still raging between her AIU and the Skynet machines. A pair of HKs were in the air and exchanging fire with her Endos. She knew with the aircraft engaged, her reprogrammed machines wouldn't last much longer. They needed to move faster. She observed the plant and saw that inside Serrano's perimeter 3 more AIU stood sentry between them and their target. One atop the White Office building to the right of the main complex, one on the far left, and the third stood just in front of the plant's entrance. There were no signs of centaurs nearby. She quickly took aim at the endo high up on the office block and fired 3 rapid shots, then switched target immediately the split second she saw it drop. She fired a dozen shots, and all 3 targets were downed in a little over 3 seconds. She smiled at her handiwork. Even for a Terminator, it was exceptional shooting. She beckoned the others to follow up after her, and they reached the Serrano Point's perimeter fence without any further encounters. The plant itself loomed high and cast a large shadow over them. Cameron marched up to the fence, reached up to lace her fingers into the links, and tore it down with one hand, clearing their path into the plant. "Lead the way," John said to Cameron. She knew the plant. She'd been here before. Eyes open, mouths shut, he hissed to everyone else. They'd been lucky so far that Skynet had sent the bulk of its forces to the north, but they had no idea how many endos were inside the plant itself. Cameron led them through the open space of the car park, which was now the HK airfield. Savannah stared nervously at the 3 remaining aircraft stood idle on the tarmac, afraid the HKs could see them and would activate any moment now. An idea came to mind, and she broke off from the rest of the group towards the passive HKs, taking care to tread as quietly as she could as she stalked over to them. She'd never been this close to one before, and as she approached, she swallowed nervously at the sheer size of the thing. Stood idle, with its landing gear holding it up, it was 3 times her height and the length of a small jet fighter. Even in the darkness, she could see it well enough to make out some of its features, notably the large plasma cannon slung under its belly, almost as long as she was tall. It was pointed in her general direction, and that made her even more wary. If it came online, it wouldn't need to take off or even aim to blow her away. The whole thing looked sleek and sharp, and made her even more determined to do this. She ducked underneath its fuselage and walked in a crouch underneath it towards the plasma cannon. She pulled out a block of Semtex and stuck it to the weapon, placed a detonator on it, then made her way back out from under it. If things went south, she could press a button on the remote control, and the thing would blow sky high. Hopefully, its hydrogen fuel would take out the other 2 aircraft nearby, too. "Good thinking." Kyle slapped her on the back as she made her way back and joined them once again. "I'm not just a pretty face," she smirked back. Cameron led the group past the airfield and towards the plant proper, a large, long red building that dominated the site. Next to it was a white 6-story structure that held the offices, which in Cameron's time had been used as the Resistance's barracks. Behind the red building were the 2 reactors, encased in massive reinforced concrete domes. She took them towards an entrance at the front of the red building, all the time watching and listening for any trace of movement. John pressed the comm button on his radio and looked back at the rolling hills behind them. Up there, Allison and the others were keeping watch over them and keeping their exit route clear. "Allison," he spoke low into the mouthpiece. "We're heading into the plant. Let us know if there's any trouble outside." "Will do," she replied quickly. Cameron pushed through the heavy double doors first and entered the building, stepping into the main corridor that ran the length of the structure. Above them hung a series of metal pipes that ran along the ceiling and turned off at various junctions. The lights inside were dull red emergency lighting Skynet, not seeing the necessity of wasting energy on the neon strip lights that brightly illuminated the entire plant when she and Sarah had infiltrated as temporary workers. Everything was similar to how she remembered it, with the exception of the complete stillness inside. In her future, it had been a hive of activity as hundreds of resistance fighters scurried back and forth, engaged in various tasks. The plant was completely automated, so there was no need for machine crews supervising the operations. "There's a lot of cameras around here," Derek commented nervously as he marched behind John and Cameron and spotted security cameras every 20 feet or so. "They're deactivated," Cameron told him. She understood Derek's and Kyle's doubts. To them, she was nothing more than a killing machine. They didn't understand what she really was. Cameron herself still didn't fully understand anymore. She felt capable of so much more than she had before, but she wanted to find out how much so. "Where to?" John asked her. "Next turn on the right," Cameron answered. "Then up 4 stories. There any elevators we can take?" Savannah asked her. "Not without attracting attention," Cameron replied. "We've marched nearly 200 miles. What's a few flights of stairs?" Ellison shrugged. He also didn't like the idea of being in an elevator controlled by a completely automated Skynet-run facility. If the machines realized, they were inside. No, the stairs were a much safer bet, he thought. In silence, they reached the staircase and ascended up 4 stories, as quietly as they could with their boots all stamping on the ground. To John, it sounded horrifically loud, and he just prayed there weren't any more endos patrolling the inside of the place. The last thing they needed was to end up in a firefight inside a nuclear plant. That couldn't end well for anyone. At the top of the staircase was a pair of double doors with a sign reading "Restricted Area," authorized personnel only, and a security desk to the right. Savannah picked up a clipboard off from the desk's surface and wiped the 18 years' worth of accumulated dust from the front, revealing a list of names of personnel who'd logged in and out of the area housing the power distribution systems. 2 moldy coffee cups also stood on the desk, and she pulled a photo stuck to the top of one of the inactive computer screens and dusted it down. The photo showed a middle-aged man with a pot belly. Mustache and close cropped hair stood smiling with a blonde woman and 2 teenage kids, a boy and a girl. "It's like it's frozen in time," she commented. "Chances are they abandoned the place the minute they heard the bombs dropped on Jade A," Derek replied to her. "Probably rushed home to see their families." It was strange, Savannah thought. It made sense, but seeing it like this was unreal. A place under Skynet's control, right under its nose and yet seemingly untouched at least on the inside by the war and the machines. It was like someone had taken a snapshot of the plant on Jade A, and nothing had changed since then. Time had just stopped and everything had remained still and gathered dust. "I'd have thought all this stuff would have been cleared," John said. "Skynet never saw the need to remove it," Cameron told him. "Unless such things hindered the plant's operations, or its security, Skynet wouldn't commit the resources to remove human artifacts. It wasn't necessary and was an inefficient use of machines. It was easier to leave it in place." Cameron pushed the double doors aside, and the others followed after her into the corridor beyond the security desk. Beyond the doors, the passage was completely sterile, not a single speck of dust or dirt. There were no windows in this part of the plant, and the only light came from the dull, blood-red emergency lighting. They passed a number of rooms on either side, and John warily turned to face each one, aiming his weapon as he did in case there was a machine lurking around. The place was too quiet, he thought. "I thought you said Skynet had an army here," he whispered to her. So far they'd hardly seen any machines. Some were out there fighting against Cameron's reprogrammed endos, but it still seemed like what she'd said about a legion of machines being stationed here was pretty high off the mark. "That was when you led the resistance," Ellison quietly said. "I'm guessing without you, Skynet never really saw that much of a threat to the plant." "Whatever. I'll take any luck I can get," Derek murmured. This time travel stuff was pretty weird to him still, and he just couldn't reconcile Connor with some kind of strategic mastermind. The metal kept going on about different timelines or no. Whatever the reason, he was just glad there wasn't an army of machines here. "Makes our job a little easier." Finally, Cameron turned right into a large room at the end of the corridor. The walls were covered in complex monitoring and measuring instruments, a combination of older-style gauges and digital displays. Dominating the center of the room was a large island table with dozens of workstations, computer terminals, and instrument panels lined with controls, switches and knobs that none of the humans had even the remotest clue as to what they did. Chairs had been pushed back away from the workstations. The screens were all black and switched off. A number of flat-screen monitors hung from the wall, but they remained powered down, a waste of electricity otherwise, with no humans to benefit from interpreting the readings when Skynet was capable of doing so itself, hundreds of times faster, much more efficiently, and without making mistakes. Kyle stepped towards the screens and reached out to try and switch one on. Cameron shot out a hand and grabbed him by the back of his vest, roughly yanking him backwards. "Don't," she told him as he stared at her in confusion. "Skynet doesn't know we're here. We should keep it that way. If they turned on devices, then Skynet would be able to tell very quickly that the power consumption had increased and what it was caused by, and quickly deduce that intruders had made it inside Serrano Point. It was the same reason she hadn't taken them up the stairs via the elevators. "Don't touch anything," John reinforced her. "This is where we reroute the power." Kyle asked. "This is where I reroute the power," Cameron replied. "So what do you need us for?" Derek asked. As far as he could tell, they'd all been passengers on this ride. They were surplus to requirement. The machine could have just hiked up from LA to Serrano Point in half the time they had and left them all safely at the TDE. They wouldn't have had to lose 4 of their friends on the way. "We were expecting more defenses than this," Cameron replied simply. As she spoke, the bulk of her attention was working on the plant systems. The worm she'd created had provided her unlimited access to all the plant's operating systems until Skynet had retaken control. She'd designed her worm programs to also spread a virus and corrupt as many systems as possible to be particularly troublesome and slow the AI attempts to eradicate all her malware. She accessed the plant's power distribution systems and instantly saw where every last watt of energy was being directed to, evenly throughout all the factories, repair facilities, airfields, communication hubs, work camps, and research laboratories. She immediately cut off power to 106 Skynet facilities in California, rendering the AI temporarily blind and incommunicado throughout the region. She then reconfigured the power distribution and reconnected the lines that ran under downtown and through to Sierra Corp. In a matter of seconds, Weaver and the TDE were able to receive power again, and she redirected the flow of electricity straight to Sierra Corp. Cameron then created her own defensive firewalls and activated them, further blocking Skynet from regaining control of the plant. She knew they wouldn't keep it out forever, but it gave them time. Once Skynet was through the firewalls, it would have to eradicate her viruses, constantly self-replicating worm programs, and correct the myriad systems she'd corrupted. Cameron then went a step further. She disabled all emergency shutdown protocols so Skynet would be unable to shut the reactor down, preventing it from ceasing energy production and rebooting all systems. She wrote a program that would overload the reactors and cause catastrophic meltdown should Skynet attempt to shut them down. The AI was calculating, exact, and wouldn't risk losing its main supply of power in California, and would be forced to contend with the malware she'd left behind. "I'm done," she told them. John pulled out his radio and switched it to Weaver's channel. "Weaver, how's the TDE going?" "It's ready." "You're late. I've been waiting for you to contact me," Weaver replied. John thought he could detect a hint of impatience in her voice. Was that even possible? He'd always assumed Terminators, due to their design, would have practically unlimited patience. "Cameron's redirected power to you," he said back. Light it up. We'll try and get back in 2 days if we can. Out. He switched the radio back to the original setting so he could contact Allison and the others if need be, put it away and turned to Cameron. Is that it? He asked her. Are we ready to leave? Not yet, Cameron said. She curled her hand into a fist and punched a computer console as hard as she could, shattering the plastic casing and tearing through the wires inside. We need to make sure Skynet can't reroute power back from Zyra Corp. Even with all her malware in place, she wasn't satisfied it was enough. Savannah pulled out the last block of Semtex from her webbing pouch and placed it onto the central island in the room. She inserted a detonator into it and pulled out the remote control from her pocket. When she pressed the button, it would now take out the power distribution center as well as the HKs on the airfield. Good thinking, Kyle said to her. He took out a hand grenade, pulled the pin but held the handle fast in his hand. He jammed the grenade in place behind a computer screen behind the wall. When the Semtex blew, the concussion would knock the screen away and the grenade would detonate. Set explosives in the other rooms, John told them all. Derek, Kyle, and Ellison exited and went off in search of other places to plant explosives as a distraction. Savannah stayed behind with John and Cameron, and they left the room, entering the corridor. I want to get back to LA in 48 hours, John told them both. That's a hell of a trip, Savannah said. Took us nearly 5 days to get up here. John turned to Cameron. How long do you think it'll take for Skynet to get Serrano Point back under control? I don't know, she replied honestly. How long would it take you if you were in Skynet's place? He asked. At least 48 hours. Cameron had created so many problems with the plant, now that even Skynet would take time to regain control of the plant and its distribution systems. Longer once the explosives detonate, she added. The machines would have to physically reroute the power lines without the control systems in place. We'll say 2 days then, John reiterated, erring on the side of caution. He didn't fancy the prospect of it much himself. He'd hardly eaten, barely slept, and now he was the one saying they had to push on even harder and faster. They wouldn't be able to stop for anything. He didn't know how he'd cope, but he knew he'd have to somehow. It was the only way. Allison laid flat out on her stomach and watched the power plant through the night vision goggles she'd scavenged from Savannah's pack. She'd observed John and the machine leading their covert entry into the plant, and hadn't seen anything for a good half-hour or more since they'd disappeared into the main complex. She was getting nervous now. She couldn't hear any more fighting from the other side of the plant, and one of the 2 launched HKs, the other one having been shot down, hovered above the airfield and rotated its cylindrical thrust-vectored engines until they were completely vertical. Then it extended its landing gear, lowering down a few feet under the aircraft's fuselage as the HK slowly descended down onto the tarmac. The second it was down, service drones rolled forwards on fat tires and tracks to tend to the aircraft, bringing one section of otherwise still power plant to life. The fact the HK had landed could only be a bad sign. The Endos launching a diversionary attack were all gone. Keep your eyes peeled, Cooper, she told the blonde fighter lying prone next to her, watching the plant as well. The others were watching their rear and making sure their way out was kept clear. She handed Cooper the night vision goggles and shouldered her M4 in the prone position, preferring it to the bulky image intensifiers. She looked through the weapons scope, and giving her a more up-close view of the plant still in its ghostly green night sight image. See anything? She asked him as she swept her scope along the plant, looking for any signs of activity. Not yet, Cooper replied. What are you going to do when we get back? She asked him. Eat until I puke, probably, Cooper replied. After that, I don't know. Help stop Skynet, I guess. That was a given, Allison thought. Nobody in their right mind who'd lived through the war and got the miracle of being able to go back would ever allow it to happen again. How could anyone, knowing they'd have to live through it twice? They said they know how to stop Skynet, she said. You believe them. Why would they lie? Cooper asked. They were telling the truth about the time machine, weren't they? Allison nodded her head, absently. They'd told the truth about the time machine, and it seemed Connor had told them the truth the whole time, but she wondered how they knew this. What exactly did they know that would allow them to prevent the whole war and the end of the world? And why hadn't he told any of them? His guys all knew, but none of her group did. Not much of an alliance when one half withholds information from the others, she thought. Damn. I got something, Cooper growled in a low voice. Movement. Where? Allison asked. She couldn't see anything. 50 feet right of the complex entrance, Cooper told her. She swept her rifle back to the entrance. They disappeared through and moved it slowly to the right until she saw what he was talking about. She couldn't see it well through the assault rifle's sights, but she could spot something moving towards the main complex, and from the size of it, it could only be an endo. It continued on in front of the main complex and turned at the entrance. Allison bit her lip with worry as it disappeared into the building. Fuck. She pulled out her radio and held it by her left ear, holding the rifle with her right still. Connor, an endo just entered the building. I think you've been made. Understood, Allison. We're on our way out now. Thanks. John put his radio away and resisted the temptation to swear under his breath. He turned to the others stood around him and tried to look calm, though inside he was flapping big time. How the hell does Skynet know exactly where we are? He felt trickles of cold sweat running down his temples and the back of his neck, and he didn't need Cameron to tell him his heart was pounding a mile a minute. We're getting out of here, John said to the others. Everyone planted explosives, okay. Kyle, Ellison, and Derek all nodded in unison. I planted a block near a bunch of drums that said flammable on the side. Should go off like the 4th of July, Derek commented. We'll need the distraction, Cameron replied as she took point and quickly led them back through the corridor, out the double doors and past the security station and down the flights of stairs. Cameron didn't even bother with the steps, simply leaping down each flight and securing the next one as John led the others in a hurried run after her. Cameron opened a set of doors at the bottom of the stairs, and a plasma bolt immediately blasted the doorframe, missing her by an inch and pelting her with red, hot wood and plaster fragments. Cameron dived to the side and identified the shooter as she hit the ground, an endoskeleton AIU armed with a plasma rifle. She pushed her own weapon forward and fired twice, striking it in the chest and forcing it backwards as the bolts smashed through several inches of hyperalloy. Cameron! John jumped down the last half-dozen steps, rolled to the side, covering Cameron with his body as he whipped the AA-12 up and let rip with a long, loud burst of automatic at the endo. The Frag-12 explosive armor-piercing rounds smashed into the machine and penetrated through the already damaged chest plates, chewing into the delicate power generation systems and the fuel cell beneath. The machine fired off another shot, but the force of John's shotgun blasts knocked its aim far wide, and it instead struck the wall to his left as the metal fell backwards to the ground and didn't move. What the hell was that about? Derek snapped as he followed after John. It had happened so fast he'd barely had time to react. He'd been right behind Connor, but all he'd seen was the kid launch himself down the stairs and blast a tin can to pieces, over another tin can. John ignored Derek and leaned down, offering Cameron his hand to help her up. She didn't need it, but still, it was nice to have help. You okay? He asked her. I'm fine, she said as she took his hand and allowed him to help her up. She appreciated the gesture, unnecessary as it was. She hadn't been hit, and the only damage was some partial burns from the closeness of the plasma shot, and some splinters embedded in the side of her face and neck. They were superficial and would heal within hours. "Can we go now?" Savannah asked, before its friends show up. "Damn right," Kyle muttered. Metal must have heard that. If they didn't know we were here, they do now. They bolted through the corridor as a squad, sprinting through the complex towards the entrance they'd come in through. There was no alarm, Savannah realized. That had to be good, surely. Maybe the tin cans were so busy with Cameron's endos, there weren't any more nearby to hear John's burst of fire. She hoped so anyway. Finally, they reached the large, reinforced double doors, and Cameron shoved them aside roughly, forcing them open as she entered the cold night air once more. She did a visual sweep of the area around them and saw a centaur rolling outside the perimeter fence to the south, between them and the valley they'd come in from. She ducked back into the building and pulled the doors ajar, leaving it fractionally open so she could watch it go by. Its massive form towered over the fences, and the guns swiveled left and right, tracking for targets. "How long until it passes by?" John asked her. 1 minute, 13 seconds, Cameron estimated. If they moved out before that, they'd be in its line of sight. Once it had turned round the corner, the main complex would block them from its view. Ellison and Kyle brought up the rear, looked backwards and then at each other nervously as a faint sound of approaching metallic footsteps echoed behind them. "I don't think we've got that long," Ellison said warily as he shouldered his machine gun and took aim. Inside the building, it was a massive, unwieldy weapon in the confines of the corridor, but it felt comforting in his hands nonetheless. The sound grew louder and became a constant clatter, they all recognized as metal feet hitting the ground. A machine was coming. Cameron remained rooted to the spot for several more seconds and watched the centaur pass by them. Its back was now to them. They had to move. She silently slipped through the door, followed by John, and moved quietly as she could to her right, hugging the wall. Savannah and Derek followed afterwards, and then Kyle and Ellison, who didn't bother closing the door as the sound might give them away. They crept along the side of the main complex, keeping in the shadows and treading as carefully as if they were in a minefield, keeping their eyes peeled for anything they might step on that would make noise and give them away. The centaur finally rolled round the corner and out of their sight. Cameron burst out from cover and sprinted with everything she had for the fence, crossing the distance faster than any athlete in history. The moment she reached the tier she'd made in the fence, she hit the ground, lay prone and covered John as he dashed through the open ground towards her, somewhat slower than the superhuman pace she'd set. Savannah and Derek ran together afterwards, John's not-uncle reaching the perimeter just a little faster than his red-haired counterpart. Kyle and Ellison came next, and the former was surprised at the older man's speed and agility for his age. Fair play to him, he thought for a moment as Ellison kept pace with him. He definitely eats his Wheaties. Both of them ran to the fence, breathing hard as they crossed the 100-meter distance. Neither of them saw the endo appear in from the entrance they'd left behind. Neither of them saw it raise its weapon and take aim. A single plasma bolt shot through the air with a high-pitched whine and struck Kyle in the small of his back. He stumbled, inertia carrying him forward several steps as he staggered and finally fell to the ground. "Kyle!" Derek ripped off half his magazine at the endo and roared out in anger at the sight of his brother downed. Savannah and John immediately joined in the salvo and pumped their own rounds into the machine. John's AA-12 ran empty as the shells tore the tin can's shoulder apart and severed its gun arm. He instantly switched to the battle rifle and waited out. Floodlights flicked on and illuminated the air around the camp. Engines whined and whirred to life as the HKs came online and received orders to take off. Ellison turned back without hesitation and ran to Kyle, kneeling down next to him. He rolled the younger man onto his back and looked at the exit wound in the side of his gut, big enough to fit his fist into. The shot had punched a hole clean through him. There was surprisingly little blood, and he could see the wound had already cauterized. If they got him out of here and managed to treat the wound, he might just about. "I've got you," he said as he hooked his arms under Kyle's armpits and started to drag the younger man to the fence. Kyle screamed out in agony as the shock wore off, and his nerves started to feel again. As Ellison dragged him, rocks and bits of dirt got into the wound and touched raw flesh, feeling like someone had jammed a red-hot iron straight through him. He screwed his eyes shut, and his whole body tensed in blinding agony. Ellison pulled him over a sharp rock that caught against something inside his body cavity and set every nerve in his torso on fire. He screamed out as the most intense pain he'd ever felt in his life racked through his whole body. "I can't," Kyle groaned as Ellison stopped. "I'm fucked." "I'm not leaving you here," Ellison calmly shook his head. He could hear Savannah and Derek calling for both of them from the fence, and he looked back to see John and Cameron holding them both back. He carried on dragging Kyle towards the fence, straining to pull the weight behind him. An HK soared over the main complex and cast its search beam down on Ellison and Kyle, bathing them in a brilliant white glow that lit the night into day and forced the pair of them to shield their eyes. Its plasma cannon unleashed a hailstorm of blue-white bolts that hammered the ground around them, consuming both Ellison and Kyle in luminous roiling flames mixed in with explosions of dirt thrown in all directions like a volcanic eruption. Savannah froze on the spot and stared with wide, unblinking eyes at the explosion. Ellison, the man who'd looked after her since she was a little girl, who'd cared for her throughout the war and always put her first, her adoptive father for all intents and purposes, was gone. She felt numb and the world seemed to swirl around her in slow motion. "Ellison," she breathed just barely, struggling to keep the tears from her eyes. "Kyle." Derek surged forwards towards the erupting black smoke, but Cameron grabbed him and pulled him backwards. "Let me go." He snarled at her as he struggled to get out of her grip. "Kyle needs me." "He's gone," Cameron said, unrelenting. Derek spat in her face and smashed his rifle butt into her nose, to no avail. "Get off me," he roared at Cameron. "Fucking metal." John grabbed Derek and shook him like a rag doll, finding himself a hair away from smacking some sense into the man. "Forget him, he's gone." John shouted loudly, sending flecks of spittle into Derek's face. He pushed Derek out away from the plant and towards the hills and valleys to the south. He looked back and saw Savannah still stood there, staring. "I'm sorry, but we've gotta go." He shook her more gently than he had Derek. "Now." They took off at a run as the HK circled round for another pass. Cameron took Savannah's M32 and aimed both it and her plasma rifle as the aircraft approached. She unleashed a storm of superheated plasma and 40mm grenades that surged upwards and hammered into its fuselage, igniting the fuel in its tanks and exploding brilliantly like a firework in the night sky. "Light it up," John shouted to Savannah. She finally snapped out of her stunned stupor and pulled out the detonator, pressing her thumb down on the button. Explosions rocked the compound as the HK airfield went up with an almighty boom, and the hydrogen fuel tanks of the HK erupted with enough force to detonate the other aircraft nearby, creating secondary explosions that tore the airfield to pieces and flashed bright orange and yellow in the air. More explosions went off inside the main complex, though without any windows inside they remained invisible to everyone outside. Alarms sounded all through the plant, and instantly a swarm of service and fire control robots were released, approaching the flaming HK airfield, too close to the main complex, and the reactors for either man's or machine's comfort. "Let's go," John ordered them all. They'd created havoc now, and it was their chance to escape. Cameron opened up a communication link with the other 12 AIU, waiting in a nearby valley, and ordered them to attack all Skynet units again, not to damage the plant itself. She received 12 order confirmations as the Endos moved forwards and put themselves between the humans and the plant, and attacked Endos and fire control bots alike, adding to the utter mayhem all around. John led them into the valley and away from Serrano Point, using the chaos behind them to slip away. They ran as fast as they could through the hilly terrain and back towards the camp, all of them pushing themselves as hard as they could, with the exception of Cameron. Cameron was the first to reach the camp and ran past Allison without even looking at her. One by one, they all stopped behind the hill, and Allison counted them all in: the Metal, Connor, Derek, and the Ginger. They were 2 down, and a cold lump of fear formed in her throat as she realized who was missing. No, 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 no. This can't be happening. Not him. Where's Kyle? He's dead, John said. I'm sorry. Allison lunged forward and threw a fist into John's face, dropping him to the ground on his ass as he looked up at Cameron's enraged doppelganger. You fucking bastard, she snarled at him, anger, loss, and pure rage coursing through her. Kyle was dead because of him. She wanted to tear him limb from fucking limb. You led us here, and now he's dead because of you. Cameron moved towards Allison, intent on stopping her, but Savannah surged forwards like a flash and smashed her fist into Allison's face, knocking her back a step. I lost my best friend, she roared as she followed through with a punch to her stomach. She wasn't the only one who just lost someone she cared about, the selfish fucking bitch. Not to be outdone, Allison kicked at Savannah's knee and dropped her to the ground and leapt at her. They rolled around on the ground, punching, scratching, and screaming at each other. Allison yanked Savannah's hair, tearing out several strands and causing her to yell out in pain. A second later, Savannah smashed her forehead into the bridge of Allison's nose, causing a gush of blood to stream out onto her jacket. Cameron grabbed the pair of them by their jackets and hoisted both girls into the air, holding them both out of reach of each other. Enough, she snapped firmly at them, her eyes glowing irritably. Skynet will come after us. We have to move. Savannah nodded down at Cameron as she swallowed deeply and tried to compose herself. I'm okay, she told her. Cameron lowered the pair of them to the ground slowly and watched them in case they tried to restart the fight again. She was surprised at their behavior. They were still in danger, and they'd been preoccupied with fighting each other. She realized there were some things about humans she'd probably never understand. John picked himself up off the ground and went to his rucksack. Take out ammo and water, he told them as he fished spare shells from a pouch in his pack. We're ditching everything else. We can't move quickly enough with all this stuff. We're moving in 1 minute. Everyone went to their packs and fished out the most important items. Some grabbed a few morsels of food and shoved them into pockets, as well as ammunition and water bottles. John pulled out a few strips of leftover wild boar and quickly chewed on them before swallowing it down and swilling a mouthful of water after it. He pulled the drum magazine from his AA-12 and quickly reloaded it with another 20 shells before slotting it back into place. Within 1 minute, everyone was stood to and ready to move. We head south, he told them, running until we're clear of Serrano. Cooper, Derek, take the rear. Cameron and I will take point. Both John and Cameron broke into a run down the hillside and across the rugged terrain, and the others followed after them. They all wanted to put as much distance between them and the plant as possible, now. John kept looking skywards as he ran, dreading the sound of HKs after them, either some they missed in the plant or reinforcements from Vandenberg Air Base. They were in deep shit right now, All they could do was deal with it and move on if any of them hoped to make it back alive.